Hello, Bezel Triple 3 here. This is part 2 of Oprah's New Earth Chapter 1 webcast with Eckhart Tolle.
Is what Eckhart was saying in that quote in the book, man made God in his image.
Man made God in his image. This is what Eckhart actually thinks, that the God of the Bible is merely a construct of the human imagination. This is helpful to note because it forms the foundation of all that Eckhart is going to teach about humanity.
Now, isn't it interesting that you first came to recognize this when you were about to kill yourself?
Now, this shift in understanding came during a time of great mental stress and emotional depression. Eckhart came to the point of considering suicide. He said these words, "I can no longer live with myself." Here's what happens next.
I became aware of the structure of the sentence and said, if that's the case, then who is the self that I cannot live with and who am I?
Now, Eckhart sees every human being as two separate elements. First, you have the false self, or the ego. This is the part of you that is connected to the unconscious thinking mind. It's connected to the illusion of opposites. It's your own unhappy story from which all your suffering comes from. And then there is the true and essential self, which is connected to the eternal, formless energy or force, which all things exist within.
It was a kind of spiritual suicide. So the ego died. Instead of me having to jump off a bridge, fortunately, the ego died.
So let's start off and ask the question, what does Eckhart think about mankind's inherent goodness?
You don't become good by trying to be good, but by finding the goodness that is already within you and allowing that goodness to emerge. But it can only emerge if something fundamental changes in your state of consciousness.
Yes.
Eckhart seems to be saying that the essential goodness is there in all of us, but the ego or the false self gets in the way, and that is the reason for evil and suffering in our lives. However, the Bible says that it's a far greater problem than that. The Bible calls it sin or unrighteousness and tells us that it's a deep infection that is present at birth for which there is no human cure.
The essential dysfunction of the ego is still operating. So this is why we have the phrase, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Because no matter how good your intentions are, when you're still trapped in the ego, it will always take you into conflict, eventually.
Eckhart says that as long as you stay in the realm of the ego, you can never be truly good because the ego always wants for itself. Now, I agree with Eckhart here, but I would call it our sinful human nature. Even our best works are stained with sin. Even our best intentions have ulterior motives. However, what Eckhart calls ego is really selfishness that is a symptom of that deep infection that I spoke of earlier. Now, what is Eckhart's remedy for this problem of ego?
You have to go deeper beyond the realm of opposites where there's good and bad and reach a place within yourself that is unconditioned, that is what I sometimes call the formless, formless consciousness,
what I call spirit.
Expressed beautifully in the Old Testament in the little saying, "Be still and know that I am God."
Now, I really like it when people like Eckhart, who could care less about the Bible, still find themselves having to troll around through its pages to try to find nuggets that might lend credibility to their false version of reality. They're like parasites who attach themselves to the host to get exactly what they need and nothing more.
That's in the Old Testament. It contains the entire wisdom of religion in those few words.
The entire wisdom of religion? I don't think so. This phrase, "be still and know that I am God," comes from Psalm 46. This psalm is declaring that God can be trusted no matter what may come, whether earthquakes or wars or whatever else. It's the promise that no matter what is happening, we can have peace knowing that God cares for his people and will ultimately bring about their good. And it's not just any God being talked about here, but specifically the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which Eckhart conveniently omits. So what we're hearing is that the ego, the false self, the unhappy story, is illusory. And you have to press beyond that in order to tap into the essential you, which is the eternal, uncreated, formless consciousness that exists in all things. The Bible, however, says something very different. It tells us that we are created beings made by an infinitely powerful personal God. And because we have been created by this God, we are utterly and completely accountable to Him. Humanity, in distinction to all other creatures, was created to reflect God's character. However, the very mind and will God endowed us with, which finitely reflects God's own infinite mind and will, is the very thing that caused mankind to rebel against God. Once the fall occurred, mankind lost its righteousness and innocence and true knowledge of God and Himself. Mankind was no longer good, but rather damaged goods. Now, we still reflect God's image, but now it's a corrupted image. We read in Romans chapter 3, "There is no one righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, no, not one." The truth is that your unhappy story is just as much a part of you as your body and soul. All your thoughts, good and bad, about yourself and others are part of who you are as a created being with a human nature that is prone to go against God's will. And this is God's will. Live in accordance with the moral law, which Jesus nicely summed up in Matthew 22 in saying, "Love God with every fiber of your being and love your neighbor as yourself." What is in you is the awareness that the moral law is true, but sadly, the ability to live in accordance with the moral law is not in you. Yet the Bible's answer to this problem is really quite simple. Stop trying to be good enough on your own steam, because you will never measure up to God's perfect demand of moral perfection. Rather, trust in someone outside of yourself, namely Jesus, who did meet the law's demands, and allow that perfect life to be credited to your account by faith.
Be still, meaning go to that place where the mind is no longer operating, where you are just conscious without thinking. And that is the level where the eternal resides. So the eternal, the formless, the spirit, is the essence of every human being.
Now this is Eckhart's real whopper, that the real you is divine, that the real you is connected to this impersonal, eternal, formless consciousness that is present in all things. This is just a generic form of pantheism and is anti-Christian and therefore anti-Christ. There's little question that Eckhart is using the I am to describe humanity. In other words, you are God. Wasn't that the lie that Satan bamboozled Eve with, I shouldn't wonder?
The way you begin to feel that is to look at nature. If you were to go out and just be with a tree, and if you're with it for a time, you start to sense the presence of it, the stillness of it, and begin to recognize that stillness within yourself.
Now, Oprah is saying that the way you begin to feel this stillness, in other words, the godness in you, is to look at nature. And sadly, this advice is problem, not solution. God is omnipresent, which means that God is indeed in all things, but God is not all things. God is in and around a tree, but God is not the tree. Never forget the Bible's teaching regarding God, that God is the creator and everything else, all that is in creation, is separate from Him. In other words, God is a whole nother thing. Creation can tell us that there is a God, but it cannot tell us any more about Him. God has revealed Himself most clearly in the person of Jesus Christ. If you want to know how to be connected to God, look at Jesus. Get to know Jesus and place all your blue chips on Him and not on some New Age idea that you are God. As the psalmist wrote in chapter 8, "When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have made." You see, there's God who makes the things, and there's the things that God made. Don't go looking for God in the tree, because that's not where you'll find Him, but rather look upon His beloved Son, Jesus Christ, the God-man.